Today I am reading from the book Spirit of Homeopathy, book written by Dr. Rajan Shankaran. Philosophy part, chapter number 13, the state and the pathology. We have seen that when the central disturbance exceeds the limit which can be tolerated by the vital part of the body, then the disturbance is diverted to the local part and produce pathology. The type and the location of the pathology depends on the nature of the state itself. Each, uh, each state will choose a particular type of pathology as it favors, as its favorite. For example, given the choice between producing a warts and appendicitis, belladonna would be choose to produce appendicitis because here its characteristics are better expressed than they would be in the case of warts. Colocin is much more likely to affect the intestine than the producer coryza because colicky and spasmodic pain are very important part of the nature of its nature. If we do not take remedies, but the characteristic of the state, a state which has violent would prefer a type of pathology that has violence with it. Zincum with its twitching and chorea would normally aggravate the epilepsy in preference to eczema. So, the type of pathology depends upon the nature of the state, but this is not exclusive. There are other more important factors too. The inherited or acquired tendency to pathology. Inherited tendency is genetic tendency, while acquired tendency is what acquired throughout the person's lifetime. So, even though belladonna would aggravate appendicitis in preference to warts, if the person has absolutely no tendency towards appendicitis but has a tremendous genetic disposition towards warts, then belladonna has no choice but to aggravate the state of the warts. The level of vitality. If the vitality is strong, it will not allow the pathology to affect the more important parts, but will confine to the less important part of the body. The type of the pathology produced therefore depends upon very delicate balance between the nature of the state, the tendency which is acquired or inherited, and the level of vitality. So, you can have two type of pathology. Pathology without any acquired or inherited tendency. This happen in acute conditions, especially in the infection like typhoid, pneumonia, where without any tendency to lungs or intestinal disease, the virulence being a very strong pathology pathology is produced. Now, pathology with a genetic tendency, meaning inherited or the acquired tendency. In this case, again, we have two types. One, the tendency that is easily excitable, and the tendency that is less excitable. So, if person has a strong or excitable tendency, this can be excited by the almost any state in the person. For example, if person has a very strong genetic tendency towards hypertension, then almost any state, means whether it is Baradaka, Belladonna, Hippocel, whatever it is, can aggravate the tendency of hypertension. Even the state is not so intense, it will still aggravate this pathological tendency since it is so excitable. On the other hand, if the tendency is not so strong and not so excitable, then it requires intense and certain specific state to aggravate it. For example, if person has a very weak tendency towards epilepsy, then not all state can excite it. Then not all state can excite it, only certain state can, and even this need to be a very high intensity to excite them. What is the importance of understanding all this? The importance is that even though the associate some remedies with a particular pathology, we need to know that if a person has a strong inherited or acquired tendency towards particular pathology, then almost any state can cause the pathology to aggravate. we cannot then go back and say that this remedy is not capable of aggravating this pathology, and therefore we need to select one that is, for example, it usually requires strong man to cut through a tree, but if the tree is weak or already half cut, then even a weak man can make it fall. If we do not want the tree to fall, we have to remove the man who is cutting the tree, whether he is weak or strong. It is of no use saying, oh, the fellow cutting the tree is not capable of cutting it. He cannot be the culprit because he does not have any capacity. This is what we do when we find the indicated remedy by the symptom, but then proceed to rule it over, saying that it cannot produce the pathology. If the disposition, example, genetic or acquired tendency is very strong, almost every dynamic disturbance can excite it, and so we have to see what the internal dynamic disturbance is and direct our treatment towards it. For example, let us take the remedy of spagilia. Spagilia has many neurotic pains, and naturally when this state is found in a person with a tendency to headache, it produces the typical spagilia headache. The pain that goes from the occiput to the left eyeball, producing the feeling as if they would come out of the socket. Now, this tendency to favor headache is so strong in spagilia that even if the person has slightest tendency to headache, he will definitely get severe headache of this type. But suppose a spagilia state exists in the person who has absolutely no tendency to headache, then what happened? The state will encourage the type of pathology to which the patient does have a tendency. As for example, the asthma. You may find a person with asthma, the mental state of spagilia, the modality or the characteristic of spagilia, or indeed the generality of spagilia, but not the headache, it's a asthma. Take again for example aesculus. It has a venous congestion which is susceptible, which in a susceptible person will produce typical sore and swollen piles. But what if the aesculus state is found in a person without the tendency to piles but with a tendency to conjunctivitis? In this case, you will see swollen veins in the eye instead of rectum. You are likely to miss the remedy here because your mind is accustomed to associate the aesculus with the piles and spagilia with the headache. So you fail. Also, we can make big mistake when we are use pathology alone as a guide to the remedy. We may get a case of piles with the local symptoms suggesting the aesculus, but this patient may have a general central state of spagilia. Since he has strong tendency to piles, he may have them, though spagilia is not typically known to for piles. This happened because spagilia may not have been proved in a person with such a tendency. So we do not know whether spagilia can encourage this tendency, and if so, what the local characteristics are that it can produce it. Even if the local characteristics of the pathology indicate a remedy clearly, we still have to confirm if the concomitant, the mental and the general level fit the remedy too or not. Otherwise, it is bound to fail. What is the more important to note is that given pathology can be found under several states and under several remedies in one form or another. If some remedies are not listed against that particular pathology, it may be due to the fact that the remedy was not proved in a person with a tendency towards that specific pathology, or not used in the patient with such condition. But if we find that mental, generals and characteristic fit it into the far safer to the give same remedy rather than one that fits the pathology alone. Pathology should only lead us to examine the remedies and see if any one of these suit the patient. The safest way to proceed is to select the remedy that covers the mentals and generals, proceeding in the reverse direction. Example, proceeding from the local symptoms or starting with the pathological remedies first can be dangerous and misleading. One more thing needs examining, and that is the prognosis of the case. Our idea of prognosis prognosis is quite different from the allopathic idea. Our prognosis differs from the case to case. It is necessary to divide the prognosis into different subtypes, like case with the pathology based on tendency which is not excitable, or in other words only excitable by specific and intense state. This case have the best prognosis. If we relieve the intensity of the state, then the pathology will beautifully regress. Second, case where the pathology is not so intense but the state is very intense, and this intense state cause an aggravation of the pathology. In this case too, the prognosis is excellent. We can be almost sure of reversal of the pathology. And third one, those cases where the pathological tendency is quite strong and which can be aggravated by almost any state of the intensity. Here the prognosis is very poor, because even if we bring down the state to a large extent, the pathology will keep on being aggravated by it. And fourth one, those cases where there is a pathology but there is no tendency to it, as in acute diseases. Here too the prognosis is excellent. With the reversal of the state, the pathology will disappear. How do we determine whether the pathological tendency is intensely excitable or not? The pathological tendency is intense if it is aggravated by the state which is not intense. If, for example, there is a weak central disturbance and the pathological condition is increased, in this case, you find that the pathological condition will predominate. To summarize the whole discussion, if we find the pathology is being aggravated by the intense specific central disturbance, the prognosis is good. The pathology is reversible. On the other hand, if we find the pathology is being aggravated by the weak non-specific central disturbance, whatever the disturbance is, it is still aggravate the pathology, then we find the prognosis is very poor. This is irreversible because a patient has a strong tendency to the pathology.